Hold on, look at this. A government-issued banknote. Official seal of the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe. Face value, $100 trillion. You can buy one on eBay today for about $5 because it is worth more as a souvenir than it was as currency in the country that printed it. That note is real. It was printed in January 2009. 5 governments, Zimbabwe, Venezuela, Cuba, Iran, and the Soviet Union, on 4 continents, made the same promise. Seize the most powerful industry. Give its wealth to the people. End foreign control forever. Every single one ended in famine, hyperinflation, or economic ruin. And every single one eventually ended up desperate for the very expertise it destroyed. The documented record on this is not ambiguous. We will get to what Zimbabwe's government quietly announced in 2020, the thing nobody thought to connect back to the year 2000. We will get to what Venezuela handed an American oil company in 2022. And we will get to a Soviet secret that turns the entire ideology of nationalization into something close to a confession. But the detail that ties all 5 of these stories together comes a little later. Let's start with what they had. In 1999, Zimbabwe was called the breadbasket of Africa. That was not a metaphor. Approximately 4,500 white commercial farmers managed the majority of Zimbabwe's most productive commercial farmland. What they produced was consequential. Zimbabwe was a major regional maize exporter, supplying neighboring countries annually. Tobacco, the country's largest foreign currency earner, made it a recognized player in global commodity markets. There were functioning supply chains, working rail infrastructure, and an agricultural export economy that surrounding nations studied as a model. For the region, Zimbabwe's farms worked. But underneath that prosperity ran a fault line. The Land Apportionment Act of 1930, a piece of British colonial legislation, had legally reserved Zimbabwe's most fertile commercial land for white settlers and explicitly barred the black majority from owning it. This was not an informal arrangement. It was statute. Black Zimbabweans had been excluded from productive land ownership by law for generations. The dispossession was real. The resentment was real. By 2000, the political pressure to address it had been building for 20 years since independence. Venezuela's story has the same architecture. In the late 1990s, PDVSA, Petróleos de Venezuela, was producing approximately 3.5 million barrels of oil per day. It was regarded internationally as one of Latin America's most professionally managed state energy companies. Venezuela held what is now confirmed as the world's largest proven oil reserves, roughly 300 billion barrels, more than Saudi Arabia. The wealth was real. The company functioned, but its profits were concentrated in Caracas and in the upper tiers of PDVSA's management structure, and the workers living directly above those reserves saw comparatively little of it. The political grievance driving what came next was not manufactured. Cuba and Iran followed the same pattern. Genuine golden age, genuine grievance, same decision. And it's that second half of the story, what these governments discovered they had actually destroyed, that changes how you understand everything we've just covered. But what was really operating inside these industries was something the nationalization decrees never named, and losing it proved impossible to undo. Zimbabwe's agricultural collapse didn't happen because of drought. Didn't happen because global commodity prices turned against it. Didn't happen because the land stopped being productive. It happened because of a decision made in February 2000. And Venezuela's oil sector collapsed for the same reason, executed 3 years later. The grievances driving those decisions were genuine. In Zimbabwe, the Land Apportionment Act had structured an entire colonial economy around the legal exclusion of the black majority from productive land ownership. That wasn't ancient history, it was the living inheritance of post-independence Zimbabwe. And Mugabe was not wrong that it constituted a problem requiring a solution. In Venezuela, PDVSA's revenue was flowing past the workers living above the oil fields, and the company had developed into something close to a state within a state, technically competent, politically autonomous, and largely insulated from accountability. These were not invented grievances. The error was in the assumption that seizing the industry and purging the people who ran it were two separable operations, that the production would continue without the producers. But here's the detail that often gets lost in the telling. In Zimbabwe, the highest human cost of the farm seizures fell not only on the white farmers who were expelled. An estimated 300,000 black Zimbabwean farm workers, the people this policy was designed to benefit, lost their livelihoods when the farms ceased to function. The employment networks, the credit relationships, and the processing facilities that depended on those farms all collapsed. The wealth didn't redistribute. The productive system fell, and the workers at the bottom of that system fell the furthest. In Venezuela, when Hugo Chavez fired approximately 18,000 PDVSA engineers and technical staff in early 2003, his government believed it was removing a disloyal class. What it had actually done was export the operating knowledge of the entire Venezuelan oil sector. Those engineers relocated to Colombia, to Brazil, to Trinidad and Tobago, to Texas. The oil fields remained. The expertise emigrated. Zimbabwe's annual inflation reached 89.7 sextillion% in November 2008. That is not a typo. Calculated from Zimbabwe's own economic data, that figure has 22 zeros. Venezuela's oil production fell from 3.5 million barrels per day in 1998 to approximately 350,000 barrels per day by 2020. That is not a typo. A 90% collapse over 2 decades in the country holding the largest proven oil reserves on Earth. You can seize an oil field. You cannot seize 20 years of knowing how to run one. And what Zimbabwe's government did in 2020, quietly, with no announcement connecting it to the year 2000, is the part that makes everything else undeniable. Which is exactly why, in country after country, the endgame of nationalization follows the same pattern, and why the most powerful governments in the world ended up going back for what they destroyed. In July 2020, the government of Zimbabwe signed what it called the Global Compensation Deed, a formal agreement to pay approximately $3.5 billion in compensation to the white farmers whose land had been seized under the Fast Track Land Reform Program 2 decades earlier. Not full restitution. The amount was a fraction of the value taken, but it was a signed financial acknowledgement, in the language of a legal instrument, that the government needed what it had destroyed. Zimbabwe began quietly encouraging some of those former farmers, many of whom had resettled in Zambia, Mozambique, and South Africa, to return. The country that had expelled the people who fed it was now formally paying to get them back. In November 2022, Venezuela's government granted Chevron Corporation, an American oil company representing the precise category of foreign interest PDVSA, had been nationalized to displace, a formal license to expand operations in Venezuelan oil fields. PDVSA, stripped of its technical workforce 2 decades earlier, had been separately reaching out to Venezuelan petroleum engineers living in the diaspora, offering contracts to return. The national oil company, built to end dependence on foreign expertise, was purchasing that expertise back at market rates from abroad. Cuba remains structurally dependent on outside subsidies, Soviet through 1991, Venezuelan through the 2000s and the 2010s, now increasingly dependent on foreign tourism revenue to substitute for the sugar export economy it dismantled. Iran has spent 4 decades attempting to attract back the foreign oil investment it expelled in 1979, still unable to restore pre-revolution production levels despite holding the world's 4th largest proven reserves. And then there is the story that closes the picture entirely. The Soviet Union, the communist state that had forcibly collectivized its agriculture between 1929 and 1933, murdering and deporting millions of independent farmers, the kulaks, the class enemies of the collective, was, by 1972, secretly purchasing grain from the United States and Canada. 30 million tons, the largest single grain purchase in recorded history, negotiated through intermediaries before the full scale was publicly known, disclosed later through congressional investigations. The communist empire that had destroyed its farming class to build the socialist future was being fed, in secret, by American capitalists, the ideological enemy it had committed itself to outlasting. Every government that promised liberation from foreign dependence ended up more dependent than before it started. You can seize an industry. You cannot seize the institutional knowledge that makes it run. That knowledge was not stored in oil wells or in farmland. It was stored in the people who had spent careers learning how to operate them. The petroleum engineers, the agronomists, the supply chain specialists, the credit networks and equipment suppliers, and processing technicians who made the whole system function. When those people were expelled, fired, or fled, the knowledge left with them. A government decree can transfer legal ownership in an afternoon. It cannot transfer 20 years of institutional knowledge in a generation. This was not a series of unconnected misfortunes. Zimbabwe, Venezuela, Cuba, Iran, and the Soviet Union each followed the same documented sequence. Seize the industry, purge the expertise, watch production collapse, quietly seek the expertise back at enormous cost, years or decades later. The ideology varied between the cases. The mechanism did not. Every government that tried to nationalize its way to prosperity eventually had to privately acknowledge what its own production data made undeniable. You can sign a decree. You cannot sign expertise into existence.